There are many evils in the world. Most are obvious to us due to their clear destructive nature, but some evils are more hidden than others. Some evils are commonplace in certain nations, so integrated that it is hard for one of their members to see the fallacy in their thinking. One such evil has plagued civilizations for centuries, constituting a problem just large enough to torment the recipients of it, and yet just small enough that little major government action is taken to combat it. I am, of course, talking about racism. Yes, racism is no alien concept to the States, but it is because of this repulsive history of hate that most consider America, even to this day, to contradict its reputation as a melting pot of different ethnicities. This is the prevailing perception of some ethnic youths. Of course, after a brief look at the past decades of American sociology, those youths might not only second guess their views about modern America, but perhaps even realize they've been taking their own era for granted. The oppression of non-Caucasians in North America is as old as its discovery. The Native Americans were the first to experience the blunt of Europe's arrogance in old America. Everyone remembers the Thanksgiving dinner, but that tender time did little to stop the English colonists from forcing the American Indians out of the East. Of course, the natives were not the only non-Caucasians to become under the white man's boot. The next inevitable step in colonization was slavery. As per the standard, Africans were abducted or sold by their own kind to slave traders and shipped off to North America to tend the crops and mine resources. Slaves weren't like bond slaves. They had no rights. If they complained, they were killed and replaced like a malfunctioning cog. At least minorities today have the luxury of complaining and getting what they asked for, let alone living to tell about it. Slavery went on unhindered for the next century, up until the Civil War broke out in a successful effort to end slavery in America. While the outcome of the Civil War technically made African Americans legally free, they were a far cry from being treated equally in this country. African Americans were wrongfully oppressed and segregated by the white Americans, in some instances treated even more brutally than while they were enslaved. Eventually, the oppression became an organized effort through the formation of the Ku Klux Klan, a league of radical extremists that set out to rid America of all blacks, Jews, and even Catholics for a time. Native Americans haven't been faring so well either for the past few centuries, having their majority of their people wiped out and their lands taken away, treated perhaps with even more malice than the black people. Not to mention the other races such as the Mexicans, Chinese, and Japanese were spouted and repressed with a cruel passion. For the next several generations, the cold-blooded hate persisted with further. Regrettably, the aggression on these minorities was commonplace during the 20th century. Black people were denied access to certain stores, restaurants, jobs, votes, even careers that they were perfectly qualified to have. Races were harassed sadistically. Blacks, Mexicans, and Asians could barely hold jobs as gardeners, butlers, maids, or assistants. Minorities were robbed, framed, kidnapped, tortured, and even murdered by people like the Klan, in some cases without even coming to the attention of a court for a lack of interest. Take my great-grandmother, Hattie Kitchen, for example. She worked as a maid 6 days a week, only earned $6 a week. As far as I know, she was never even referred to with her last name, only her first name. The segregation of the past went so far as to almost completely blot out the very existence of non-white Americans from the media. It felt as though this cloud of hatred and subhumanization would continue until the end of time. Of course, its own end came not by law, but by passive rebellion. A great breath of fresh air finally presented itself to the minorities in the form of the civil rights movement. Easily the most iconic participant was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He and other revolutionaries put their lives on the line for years, making dozens of public displays to win the hearts of the people. Around this same era was birthed another famous movement, the hippie movement. Thousands of youths would rally together, abandoning whatever backgrounds categorized them, and played music to celebrate their newfound philosophical freedom. It is also to be of note that these demographics were still heavily persecuted for their actions, no matter how innocent. Racism finally lost its hold in America by the 1980s, and America finally realized its reputation as a melting pot. This is the depressing history of the relationship between Caucasian Americans and other races. Yet, through all of this, America has managed to recognize the depravity of racism and has rediscovered the true meaning of freedom to form one big, beautiful nation. As a young African American male, it would be dishonest of me not to remind the public that our African American president is reaching the closing of his second term. Yes, America was and still is a little racist, but we can learn to relish the freedom we live in. For a century and a half, Americans with all skin colors have shed their blood to defend the liberty that we enjoy.